Hi, everybody. So lovely to have you all here today. So I am Sally from the Mable marketing team. Yeah, how exciting to have so many people here to hear from our excellent presenters. Can you hear me? I'm seeing a few comments that people can't hear. Could I just get a thumbs up or something that people can hear? All right. Yes, okay, other people. Thank you. Good to hear. So look, before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise a continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So today I have some real experts in the room for you all. So we have Paul, Micallef and Shannon Lea, the co-founders of Autism From The Inside. This is an organisation that provides a safe space for the autism community to connect, learn and grow. They offer a range of courses, events and coaching services, as well as running a highly successful YouTube channel. You won't believe how many subscribers they have, 300,000, so very popular. So Paul is an aerospace engineer. He was also diagnosed with autism at 30, and Shannon is also autistic and pursuing a master's in autism studies. She combines this knowledge with her personal experience of parenting a neurodiverse team to support families, teachers and parents in understanding and celebrating autism. And final slide, please, for me, if we could just go over here. Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar is going to go for an hour. We're going to have lots of time for questions, approximately 15 minutes. You can use the chat feature to please ask questions, and then Shannon and Paul will work through them at the end. For any questions related to Mable, like platform questions or how things are working, please can you just use the usual Mable channels to ask us, and we'll be able to help you properly, not on this webinar right now. There will be a copy of the webinar sent. It will be sent to you tomorrow, so you will be able to have that for your records. And when we send you the recording, there's also going to be a feedback form, and we would really, really love to hear what you think of it, so that we can use that feedback for future. All right, and over to Shannon and Paul. I've talked enough, so let's get them on now. Thank you.
Welcome to our webinar, Understanding Autistic Behaviour and Communication. So these are the 4 key points that we're going to go through in today's webinar. We're going to look at understanding autism as a spectrum of diversity. We're going to look at behaviour as communication. We're going to look at building greater empathy, understanding connection and supports. And finally, we're going to look at how the link between connection, positive autistic identity, inclusion, and social connection works. You can ask questions just throughout the webinar during the chat, and we will have a prioritised Q&A section at the end.
Yeah, so as always, with everything we do with Autism From The Inside, we are trying to help you get a felt understanding of the autistic experience, so that you can understand autistic behaviour and communication at kind of an intuitive level. So we'll be using lots of examples today, and that's why having your questions to talk through some specific scenarios at the end will be really helpful as well.
Love this slide. I've got some great pictures to talk through very quickly. So, autism is a spectrum condition. All autistic people share certain difficulties, but being autistic will affect them in different ways. Let's have a look quickly at the picture on the left-hand side, which is what people think the autism spectrum looks like. And if, like me, when you first became aware of autism and met someone with autism, you probably thought it was a little bit like a light scale or a linear scale, and it goes from one end of being less autistic to being more autistic at the other end. The autism spectrum isn't like that. It's certainly not linear. As you can see, there are core areas when autism is described. So there's a language component, executive functioning component, there's perception, sensory skills, and motor skills. And how it affects autistic people differently is the black line shape that we've popped in there. That could be one person's profile. Their profile could also be a hexagon. It could be something that resembles a four-leaf clover. But each different point on that particular scale is one point of variance in that particular field. So no one person with autism has exactly the same profile as everybody else with autism. So it's important to understand when you've met somebody with really, really good sensory skills, that if you meet somebody else with autism, their sensory skills may not be the same.
Sorry, just quickly, we did just change those slides because some of the formatting was slightly wrong, but sorry to break you off your speech, Shannon. Oh, continue.
That's all right. So as we can see on this point that that there can be at any point along these pie chart pieces can represent someone with autism. The picture that we have over here with the wonderful, wonderful brains is from Professor Temple Grandin's brain scan work that she has done with the University of Colorado. So on the left-hand side, with all the beautiful colours, is Professor Temple Grandin's brain. She's an internationally renowned scientist with autism. She has exceptional memory and visuospatial abilities. She has a PhD in animal science and is a tenured professor of animal science at CSU. She's written many books. One of the most popular books is Thinking in Pictures. So the really interesting thing about these brain scans is, one, they're of an autistic brain on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is a neurotypical brain. So someone of similar age and gender. Temple Grandin has some really interesting variants. They found that her brain, through the tensor imaging that they did, which was MRI conducted, that they had enhanced connections, and we can see those enhanced connections there in different colours. It looks rather like coral or fireworks, and they're quite spectacular. This particular area that we're looking at is enhanced white matter in her left inferior fronto-occipital area of the brain, and it connects the frontal and occipital lobes with the visual spatial capacity of the brain. So what does this mean? It means that she is exceptional. She has exceptional memory, and she has exceptional spatial abilities. The brain also contains what appear to be some differences as well. So, for example, her area that's important for language is less developed than the average person's, and she has fewer connections in a region that's involved in processing faces. But despite this, after all of the work that she's done in brain scans, she holds a perfect score on Raven's Cullen progressive matrices. They administered a range of psychological assessments, and her perfect score is actually on a test that assesses non-verbal intelligence. Her weakest skill, after all of these tests were done, is her verbal working memory. And the importance of talking about this is because many people with autism have incredible and exceptional skills or abilities or strengths, and at the same time have unique challenges. Someone may be able to be a virtuoso violinist, but struggle to be able to organise an appointment diary. These things coexist within the same brain. So when we're looking at the autism spectrum, the pictures down here are all the multicolours. When we say, what does someone on the spectrum look like? It can look like any of these figures, and they're all hugely varied.
So I can't emphasize enough that last point that Shannon was saying about sometimes we refer to this as a spiky skill set, where we are really good at some things and really not good at other things. And this type of non-uniform development is one of the easiest ways to understand what autism is. And what happens as a result of that, autism is often considered a social disability, is that the more difference you have in different areas, the harder it is to relate to your peers, because the things that I find really easy, everyone else finds really difficult. And the things I find really difficult, everyone else finds really easy. So there can be a challenge in coming into a social situation and adopting the norms and expectations of other people, precisely because we have so many differences in so many different areas. So while you can't necessarily say something specific about any one autistic person before you've met them, because we're all so different, we do share quite a significant amount of experience due to that feeling of being different and that difficulty in fitting in to typical social situations. Let's go to the next slide.
So then let's look at behaviour as a form of communication. And the process of communication requires two key factors. There has to be an exchange and there has to be an understanding for communication to be effective. I'm sure that many parents of teenagers are now realising where that communication process has possibly broken down. But communication is very, very intricate and in much more complex than we have a tendency to understand. So sharing or transmitting information, ideas and feelings successfully requires both factors to be present for the communication process to work. We now have a great quote that children don't misbehave. What they do, and teens, they behave either positively or negatively to communicate. Small children communicate through their behaviour because it's the only method of communication that they have. If or when they become verbal, they still aren't likely to articulate things like big feelings. And that subtle problems are also going to be a challenge to verbally articulate. So as parents of children and teens on the spectrum, we need to listen between the lines of children's behaviour so that we're able to discern the need that they're communicating. Setting boundaries isn't about misbehaviour. Someone's been naughty, I have to send a boundary. It's not about that. We're looking at guiding behaviour. And guidance is something that we provide through everyday interactions with our children. In the picture underneath, we've got that communication process I was talking about. So we've got a sender and a receiver. And then let's talk about some of the other things that have cropped up in the picture. So a straightforward process would be that there's an intended message that's encoded. It goes through a particular channel, whether it's talking face-to-face, whether it's via text or email. It's then decoded by the recipient and the message is received. In order to then respond to that message, the whole process has to go in reverse. Some of the complications that we've got here are we've got speaker A, or if we look at the blue circle, we're looking at a field of experience that comes into play. If we look at the other circle, we've got our listener or the receiver's field of experience as well. Now, the normal kind of model of communication puts one variable in, and they put in noise. So they say sometimes, you know, if you're chatting online or you're on a call, then there can be noise interrupting your ability to hear the other person clearly. I had to adapt this quite extensively because noise isn't the only factor that's going to encroach on autistic communication. Apart from the fields of experience, which are going to be really diverse, you've got touch, you've got sleep, you've got taste, you've got interoception. And interoception is the internal communications within our body. Many people on the spectrum find that that interoception sense is a little bit unclear, or it may have a processing delay. So what may happen is halfway through a conversation, the other person will realize that they have an urgent need, whether to have a drink of water or to sit down. And that interoception isn't necessarily clear, and it doesn't necessarily look like the messages that somebody who is neurotypical in the communication would express them. So there's also movement, if there's movement going on in the environment, or a need to move themselves, whether they need to fidget, or they've got a restless leg, or they need some kind of sensory stimulation to be able to remain regulated. There's also things like balance and smell. As you can imagine, if you walk into a science lab and it smells strongly of scientifically used experimental chemicals, it will affect the conversation. Likewise, focus will affect the conversation. First thing in the morning, maybe 5 a.m., I'm not at my verbal best, and I'm not alone in that. Sight is also a factor that affects communication and capacity. If we think about all of these things, there are lots of ways that we communicate that are non-verbal. So, and I'm going to include echolalia in this, because echolalia is a way of repeating things that are known or quotes. And echolalia is still quite an effective form of communication. And the reason is that if your young child comes up to you and says, let's count to 10, off we go, there's a good likelihood that you know that they'd like to play hide and seek, for example. Or if they quote a favorite movie, uh-oh, disaster, you'll know that something's not right. So echolalia can still function quite effectively as a form of communication, where you mimic or repeat certain phrases. There's obviously those physical elements of communication. So we're looking at moving objects, we're looking at eye gaze, we're looking at pointing, shifting your body into a different position. And then there's emotional behaviors as well, or communication. So aggression, for example, can be communicating a set of needs. Extreme reactions are often communicating anxiety and needs that aren't being met. And empathy is often communicated and often not given the recognition it deserves, because tone of voice might not necessarily reflect empathy or a particular emotion. There are other ways that they communicate. Everyone communicates physically. So there are bids for connection. If you're in a park with your child and you're in a group of mums and you're sitting down and you're trying to have that mother's group experience and your child leaps up and runs away, that can be a bid for connection. What that is actually communicating is that your child is not comfortable with the current activity. They are doing a bid for connection that they know how by running away. It's an enjoyed activity. And they are also aware that if they run away past a safe space boundary, that you are likely to follow them. So what they're trying to say is, I'm not comfortable with the current activity. I'd like your attention, and I'm going to enable that to happen in the way that I know how. Now, none of that will be verbal. There's also out of context behaviors. If someone is very, very emotional when you wouldn't expect them to be, then that is a form of communication. And all of these kinds of communication, especially nonverbal communications, I'd like to encourage the community at large to have a shift in perspective, because we're very, very quick to label these behaviours. They're naughty behaviours, they're disruptive behaviours, they're not cooperating, they're angry, they're frustrated. What we need to do is stop labelling the behaviour in personal terms, and we need to look at it in terms of ability and capacity. For example, Shannon is moving from foot to foot. That helps her focus and that helps her regulate. Shannon is not making eye contact because checking in eye contact is more effective for her. If she makes full eye contact the entire time, she will not be able to listen to the best of her ability and recall the information that's being discussed. So this whole slide is encouraging you to kind of look at communication in a different way, and understanding that if we have barriers to social interactions, if we have barriers to communicating socially, if we have barriers in understanding our feelings and our needs, and we are uncertain and anxious, then a lot of our behaviour is going to be communications-based, is going to be physical rather than verbal.
So a lot of people ask me, do children know what they need in terms of stimming and taking breaks and when they've had enough and things like that? And the answer is essentially not consciously. We don't know what we need consciously until we've come to a level of maturity to develop the self-awareness around that particular thing. So I work a lot with adults, especially with alexithymia, trying to get better at this task of figuring out what I need in the moment. And one of the strategies that we use, that a person can use on themselves, is to look at their behavior for clues as to how they feel. So if that method is really effective for an adult to learn self-awareness around their own behavior and what their own behavior is trying to communicate to them, it's even more effective when we can use it to help children to develop their own self-awareness by recognizing from their behavior what they actually might need in a situation. And it might be as simple as, we've clearly had enough of this task for today. We need to switch it up for something else. Another thing to mention around this communication is that a very, very common autistic experience is the experience of miscommunication, of being misunderstood. And my experience is very often I'm aware that there's a misunderstanding and I'm trying to correct that misunderstanding, but the other person is getting frustrated at me because they would like me to understand and I haven't understood quick enough. So in terms of trying to help understand this communication, focusing on being patient and taking your time and looking at all of the clues, the behavior and the words and the emotions and everything else can be really helpful to bridge that gap. As you can see from this diagram, the field of experience might actually be quite different. So in terms of sensory environment, for example, very often the sensory environment that I'm aware of is quite different to those around me. And it makes it more challenging to concentrate. It makes it more challenging to have that shared experience of we both know what we're focusing on right now, rather than I think that this is the most important thing, but everyone else in the room has their attention on something else. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for this one. Let's go to the next slide. So if we're looking at different behaviours, we then are able to have a greater understanding and a greater empathy of what those communications are sharing with us. So, for example, if someone's using echolalia, they might want to initiate an activity. They might be communicating their emotions. Dramatic Marvel superhero movie quotes can also reflect big emotions, or senses of injustice or sense of fairness. What we need to do then is show that we acknowledge and validate that they are communicating, and show empathy and compassion for what we think is being communicated. So in that case, if someone's sitting there and making siren noises, that can often be a sign that it's an emergency. Something's really wrong.
So acknowledging, I hear that you're making siren noises. That's fairly distressing. Are you okay? Can I help you? What can I do to make you feel better? And if that behaviour escalates, I think we're all familiar with something called an autistic meltdown. Now, this is different from a tantrum. A tantrum is goal-orientated. It requires that you make eye contact, you're aware of your surroundings, you're aware of being safe, and you're communicating either a need of wanting to change a situation, to get something that you want, a new activity, more attention, or potentially that you're tired. There are a range of reasons for tantrums, but they have those common elements to them. An autistic meltdown is different. Think of it as unable to cope, overwhelmed. It's not a tantrum because they're not trying to achieve a goal. They simply are not able to cope anymore. So when we have a meltdown, we would deal with it very differently than we would a tantrum. We need to acknowledge and validate. I understand you're not okay. Keep communication brief and succinct. You don't want to contribute to being overwhelmed. Create a safe space, of course, for the person who's having a meltdown and for you to be able to support them. Reduce sensory input if you can. If you can move to a quieter space, if you can move to or share some sunglasses, if you can move to a quieter area. And ultimately, if you can co-regulate, because this is a time where verbal communication is adding to a feeling of being overloaded. So how do you best communicate that you're there for someone and you care for them without using words and without conveying the stress in your voice that you're managing a situation that's very upsetting? Sit down by their side, breathe deeply, let them know you're here, and you're simply going to wait until they're able to re-engage with you. What's aggression communicating? Often it's a significant discomfort, because when someone else is aggressive, the most common reaction is to retreat or to back. Aggression can be communicating fear, can be communicating anxiety, and it can be communicating confusion. Aggression is often that pressure valve that goes off in between transitions when you're trying to get your child off a particular device, to doing homework, to come to dinner, to come to do any part of a daily routine. Aggression is that frustration, and it's a release. So again, acknowledge and validate that someone feels that way. Look at changing their environment. So if they're frustrated on a sports field, try to move them out of that area. Try and use some calming strategies, offer some support. Simply a drink of water and a moving to the side, away from other people's line of sight, can be really effective. Use social reflection and compassion. When someone is aggressive, it's a sign that they're not coping particularly well. So be compassionate that they're feeling so provoked. And try and support them in such a way where their autistic identity is intact. The last thing we need is to start labelling children at 8 and 10 and 12 that they're aggressive. This is not going to help at all in having them understand themselves, their feelings and their behaviours. And what can withdrawal communicate? It can be that they might be naturally introverted, but if they're constantly withdrawn, that can be something else. It could be self-esteem, could be social rejection or a fear of social rejection. It could be a symptom of anxiety or depression. And again, let's look at acknowledgement, validation, a mental health check. Let's look at making some social scripts to explain social situations. Practice having a go at social conversations, role play certain situations. Let's look at some positive mental health strategies and self-care strategies. And let's also look at communicating their needs and interests, so that if you feel understood, you're less likely to be withdrawn on a regular basis.
So let's read the title of this slide again. Building greater empathy and understanding, right? The goal, and that will help us to understand communication, is building empathy and understanding. So in order to do that, it's actually our job as presumably the more regulated person, especially if the other person we're trying to build empathy and understanding with is unregulated at the moment, to focus on listening instead of reacting. If there's an unexpected behavior, the temptation is to instinctively react. No, don't do that. Something like that. Whereas if we can, like Shannon said, manage ourselves first, then it becomes easier to empathize with the other person, because we can keep listening and keep asking all the helpful questions, like, what's going on for you? A very helpful question to focus on is, what is the other person feeling at the moment? What is the emotion that this behavior is communicating? And when we identify the emotion, it becomes easier to empathize with the experience. If we focus on the behavior that is clearly unexpected and probably inappropriate, then it's easier to react against that behavior. If we ask the question, how is this person feeling? What emotion are they expressing? It becomes easier to create that empathy. And finally, with the positive autistic identity, I learned very early on that my emotions were probably inappropriate. I was going to be laughing when I shouldn't be laughing, or upset when I've got no reason to be upset. And so what happened is I essentially learned to ignore my own emotions. What we would like to do is help autistic people, especially children, to be in touch with their emotions so that they can understand their own needs. And that means validating, responding to the emotion and allowing it to be there, rather than reacting against it and saying you shouldn't be upset, or you shouldn't be sad, or you shouldn't be reacting in this way. Next slide.
So building greater connection and supports. If we use that understanding and empathy, we can build greater connections with our family, our friends, our groups, even strangers, due to better communication and understanding. That's not necessarily more verbal communication. It's being able to look for and interpret communication. We can create stronger and healthier relationships. We can use active listening. We can use empathy. A common trait in the autistic community is processing delays, because the autistic brain processes information differently. If that's the case, then we need to allow a little bit of time for someone to think about what's going on and to process that information. If we have a better understanding and empathy to non-verbal cues, if we share stories, and we have an acceptance of a positive autistic identity, the last thing we want to do as a parent is discipline a child for autistic behaviour. Autistic behaviour is not defiance, it's not confronting, it's not being willful, it's not being difficult. Autistic behaviour is autistic communication. It is authentic, and we don't want to discipline someone for stimming. We don't want to discipline for someone for not putting a jacket on, thinking that they're just trying to make their own choices and be individual, when it may simply be a case that they don't respond to temperature in the same way as other members of the family, and they simply don't feel cold. How do we build greater connections and supports? Really, really emphasising autistically led supports. We've had some wonderful opportunities. I'm sure Paul will mention them with our online summits in the past years, of speaking to global experts who are also on the spectrum themselves. Making sure it's an autistically friendly environment, so that there is a range of opportunities for taking part, so that sensory and physical needs are supported, so that you're able to stim during a presentation, or you're able to take a break if you need to, or you're able to walk around and not feel shamed for doing so. We also really recommend neurodiversity affirming techniques. We've had some wonderful professionals who themselves on the spectrum are looking at autistic traits and autistic language and reframing them. So the neurodiversity affirming, so that's a different form or a way that the brain grows and develops that identifies neurodiversity. It acknowledges unique strengths and interests and support needs. It should also acknowledge diversity. It should also encourage an autistic identity where you don't have to mask, where you don't have to mimic neurotypical traits, where you don't have to remain always seated, always with eye focus, always engaged in what is a socially prescriptive way. So we want to be able to have supports that include adaptations and supports and validates a positive autistic identity.
So why do we need greater connection and supports? One easy way to think about it is a lot of autistic people describe that it's like the world is it's like life is on hard mode. And why is that? Because our society, our environments, our institutions, our way of life, our culture in general is designed to help most people be mostly good most of the time, right? And if you happen to fall outside of what is considered normal, for example, if I have to move more than other people, then sitting down might be a problem. If I have more sensitive hearing than other people, then sitting in a noisy cafe might be a problem. So what we are actually trying to do is deal with a fairly challenging environment and social world. So what the support we need is to help find appropriate strategies that make it easier for me to not only survive, but participate and thrive in those kind of situations. So I think the neuroaffirming positive identity stuff that Shannon was talking about is one of the key things. Because if I am trying to be like everyone else, trying to look and sound like everyone else, that inevitably means that I'm going to start hiding my behavior and doing what someone else thinks I should be doing rather than what I actually need to self-regulate. And that leads to bottling up all of these emotions, and eventually that will come out in probably a less positive way. So if we can instead encourage any coping strategy like harmless stimming, like having a fidget in my hands, for example. I don't have a fidget at the moment. I normally do, but I was known in my engineering job. I always had a pen in my hand, like 24/7. And that wasn't hurting anyone. And it was helping me to concentrate and listen in meetings and everything like that. So if we can find good strategies and encourage behavior, even if it's outside the expected behavior, if I'm expected to be in a meeting at work and sit there and pay attention and make eye contact, if that's not working for me and I need to do something else, then finding a good solution is going to be better for everyone in that sense. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide.
So the link between connection and positive autistic identity. In the chat, I noticed one of the questions was, is avoidance a strategy? Absolutely it is. Thinking of reasons why we would avoid social interaction, why we would not give something a go. One is we avoid the possibility of failure. If we don't have a go, then we're not going to make mistakes. Another reason for avoidance could just be a lack of understanding about what's personally involved. What do I need to commit to? What do I need to communicate? Avoidance can also be perfectionism and anxiety, and it can also be low self-esteem. So avoidance is still a form of communication in the neurotypical community. but it is very common in the autistic community as well. So autistic individuals who feel a strong sense of affiliation with other autistic people and have some positive views about the autistic community in terms of their social identity will have improved self-esteem and psychological well-being. Firstly, just by knowing I'm not alone, because the first acknowledgement is then self-acknowledgement is, and I had it when I was diagnosed, was that I'm different. From that step, we need to know that we're not alone and that our difference is simply a difference. It's not better or worse. It is human. All autistic behaviour is human behaviour. So improved self-esteem and psychological well-being also comes from self-awareness and having your needs met. And we can see evidence of this by lower depression and anxiety scores. So just letting you know, when we talk about neurodiverse, there are other things included in that other than autism. So dyslexia is in there as well, ADHD and ADD, dyspraxia, OCD are all under that neurodiverse umbrella. Now, sometimes people with autism can have these conditions. They can all exist at the same time. Sometimes these conditions can exist separately, and it doesn't necessarily mean that someone is autistic just because they have dyslexia or dyspraxia or ADHD. But it's also important to look at some of those autistic strengths, because I think that a lot of the time we're very focused on what happens in a meltdown, in a public place, in safety. We're concerned about those really, really challenging behaviours that make us feel disempowered. We don't know how to help. We don't know what to do. So we always like to advocate a strengths-based approach. So look, some of the common autistic strengths of people, we're looking at excellent long-term memory. My son has an eidetic memory, and he can be my sat-nav anytime we go driving, even if it was 6 or 7 years ago. Great sense of humour, honesty, loyalty, integrity, accepting and non-judgmental. Anybody with any other challenge, whether it be physical, whether it be a disability or not. Autistic children are very inclusive children. They can have a strong focus on detail. They can have exceptional hyperfocus. They can have fantastic observational skills. My son in particular likes to correct his teachers when they put presentations on the board. We've now learned to do this in a humorous way. And his class actually applaud him and have a laugh with him. So there are some really, really wonderful autistic traits and autistic skills, and we like to be able to use them to create strategies that are neurodiversity affirming, but also work with your strengths. If you are a visual thinker like Professor Grandin, then do all of your study in diagrams, in diagrammatic form. It makes more sense. Use what you are most comfortable with.
So there's a comment in the chat around discipline, and I think it really relates to this slide, because we've been talking about a positive autistic identity and how to support and things like that. And very often, discipline and structure and knowing how a situation works can actually allow a person to find a good way to cope in the situation. So if I know what the consequences are and they're fair and I can see natural consequences, then it actually empowers me to come to a good solution for myself as to what I would like to do. Like Shannon said, autistic behavior is human behavior. Behavior makes sense when you understand our experience, when you understand the sensory processing and the other types of autistic experience that some of which we've mentioned, then the behavior makes sense. The anxiety sometimes makes sense, and the reactions to certain situations make sense as well. So what we're trying to do is not to punish someone for doing their best in a situation because we've underestimated how difficult the situation is. And that's why we're focusing on this positive autistic identity, because if the message I'm receiving from the people around me is constantly, your best isn't good enough, do better, you're getting punished even though you're trying your hardest, then the level of shame and self-esteem issues that come with that can be extremely damaging to mental health, and aren't in anyone's best interests in the long run. Let's go to the next slide.
So the link between inclusion and social connection. There's a key link between social well-being, mental health, belonging, and connectedness. Inclusion creates a culture of growth because you have diversity represented. People feel visible, they feel acknowledged, they're more likely to engage in what's going on. Stable and supported relationships increase the likelihood of making healthy choices. So if we have stable relationships with our teachers and with our families, and with the medical services that we use, we're more likely to make healthy choices for ourselves because our sense of self-worth is higher. If we're able to cope with difficult and challenging situations and anxiety and depression and stress and increased resilience at both individual and community levels, that only happens if you have a seat at the table. If you're not there, if you're not included, if you're not able to participate as you are, then that is the greatest obstacle to supporting our autistic community. When it comes to discipline, very quickly, we have hard boundaries, just as all parents need to have hard boundaries. You cannot do something that hurts other people. You cannot do something that hurts yourself. Hard boundaries are there for a reason. They are replicated in the wider community, and they replicate how we live our lives long term. And they're very important. Soft boundaries have a little bit of flexibility because they allow you an attempt to learn. And the safest learning environment is going to be that close home family environment where the focus should be on learning and not necessarily getting something right. It should also be focused on having a go. And also when you have the capacity, when parents and children have the capacity to reflect on how something goes, that's often one of the greatest opportunities to learn. There are levels of inclusion, whether it's at a community level, whether it's an emotional inclusion, whether it's a contribution, an intellectual contribution, whether it's a spiritual inclusion, whether it's comprehensive inclusion. So comprehensive inclusion happens with good health and quality of life and good education, where all of our needs are being met. So that's the ideal for inclusion. But in order to have inclusion and social connection, we need to have that empathy and understanding.
So the last thing I'll say about this before we can move on to some questions, so feel free to put your questions in the chat now, and we'll have a look at them in a second, is that autistic people want to be included. As a general rule, we want friends and social connections just as much as everyone else. In fact, sometimes even more so, because it's typical for autistic people to say things like, I'm not interested in superficial relationships. I'm not interested in small talk. I want to connect with another person. I want to be seen. I want to be heard. I want to be understood. And part of that is because we don't get that very much naturally. So we would like to be included. It's hard. There are good reasons in the world that make it hard. Please help. All right. There are a lot of things you can do to help include us in more and more situations. And one of the ways to do that, as Shannon was saying before, is creating safe places where I can relax and be myself and be included at the same time. You can imagine the stress of constantly worrying that I might accidentally do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing or misinterpret the situation or get punished for something that I don't fully understand what I did wrong. And very often that is a social punishment. I do or say something socially that I don't fully understand the gravity of the situation, and then suddenly I'm being punished by my peers, for example, with exclusion or bullying or teasing or something like that. So is it any wonder that a lot of autistic people end up withdrawing? We have this stereotype of the autistic person that likes to spend time by themselves. And one of the reasons is because being included is difficult. So that's where you can help. Okay, let's move on. So Shannon, I'll let you, we'll send through the slides so we don't need to dwell on this, but here are a handful of references that you can have a look at later. So let's take a look at some of the questions.
One of the questions here is, what's the best way to cope with social anxiety? Coping with social anxiety is a really, really broad topic. A couple of suggestions I would make are, one, acknowledging that the anxiety is very real. Understanding that social anxiety stems from two things. One, the unpredictable nature of social interaction and life. And two, perhaps a concern about being able to interpret social interaction and communication clearly. In terms of social interaction, it's really important to make some very small, identifiable, clear goals and some steps to achieve that goal. So if there is social anxiety and you want to encourage your teen to be able to go to a party, then you can set it up in terms of contacting the family first, confirming where they'll be, identifying who will be coming and attending. So is it going to be peers? Is it going to be family as well? What activities will be at the party? And set an anticipation for how long you would like to go. 30 minutes is a wonderful way to start. Set the expectation that you don't have to stay at the start of a social engagement from beginning to end. Give as much understanding and support around how the event will go and proceed. Talking to small children, one of the things we did was talk about how we sing the happy birthday song and how we often have a cake that comes out, and often there are candles on it, and the candles have to be blown out, and then there's an encouragement to make a wish. So if you can look at a social situation and break down those social expectations and talk about them, then you can set your goal, then you can set the steps for achieving that goal, and then you can give it a go. And every time you give it a go, you have some downtime afterwards to be able to decompress. And when you feel able to, you re-engage and have a chat about how they think it went. Often you'll find that there's a lot of anxiety beforehand. And then I took my son to his first concert, and it was Pink and it was live. And I had 15 strategies in place for how I would cope with attending and meeting that event. And in the end, he had a fantastic time. And we only needed one or two of the strategies that we had in place.
So very briefly, just to add to that on social anxiety, the opposite of anxiety, fear, is feeling safe. So if you're unsure what to do, just think, what would help myself if I'm feeling the anxiety, or what would help the other person to feel safe in the situation? It's not always a mental activity. It's an emotional, what would feel safe. So things that commonly feel safe, knowing what's going to happen, predictability, knowing that I've got someone looking out for me. It's a safe place. It's not a dangerous situation. And knowing the expectations, and also feeling like they're realistic and I can actually meet them. So that's why the types of strategies that Shannon was mentioning can be so effective, because they're speaking directly to, how can I make this situation feel safe?
One of the questions we've had is about aggression. And while I talked about aggression, it was probably more, at school or in a social situation. The most common form of aggression can often be in daily activities. And it's when you go towards somebody and you try and limit something that they're enjoying doing to do something that they're not mentally invested in. So, for example, they're using their iPad and watching or playing their favorite game, and you need them to transition from that activity to engage with something else. Aggression is often one, it's an expression of frustration from going from one activity to transitioning to another. The other is that that particular activity that they're on is meeting a number of their needs. It may have a calming effect. They may have a positive online identity. Working online provides controlled visual and auditory stimulation. It's a highly controlled and regulated environment in some gaming environments. And there's opportunities to do things online or experience things online that it's physically impossible to do socially and within your community. So children and teens in particular have a lot of anxiety about moving from gaming time to another activity. There's anxiety about judgment, about it being confiscated, especially if we take some very hard boundaries in terms of using tech time. There's also anxiety about personal space. There are a whole lot of things that can go on there. I think when it comes to transitioning, we need to give children and teens on the spectrum as much detail as possible. So in 10 minutes, we're going to ask you to transition and come to dinner. Okay, you've got 5 minutes to go. Don't start any new activities as part of the game. Finish up your existing ones, and then we're going to transition. Okay, 1 minute before we're going to move to the table for dinner, there's going to be a bell or a buzzer, and it could be even inbuilt in your iPad. Then we're going to kindly come over and say, hi, it's dinner time now. Really love you to join us. So it's doing those steps and those strategies to make sure that transitioning from one thing to the other it's signposted so that you know what's happening. You are aware of the passing of time. You're aware of how you need to organise your emotions and how you feel about it. You're aware of how you need to wind things down. And then you're aware of the shift of activity, and it's a clear activity.
And we were talking about behaviour as communication before. So what does aggression communicate? And were there other attempts at communication that were not listened to? Very often communication escalates. And if you didn't hear me the first time, I'll say it again louder, or maybe I'll say it again in a way that can't be ignored. An example that let me say one other thing and then I'll link it back with an example. Another reason that autistic people often feel really upset is around a sense of fairness and justice. Maybe you've experienced this, because it doesn't always feel like we're treated fairly. Imagine a situation where the person opposite, I'm in primary school, the person opposite me is chewing really loudly and it's really hurting my ears and it's uncomfortable. And I just really, it's causing me pain just to sit and listen to that. And I've asked the person to stop doing it and they didn't. So I hit them and now I'm in trouble. And I don't fully understand why they were allowed to hurt me by chewing loudly and I wasn't allowed to hit them to get them to stop hurting me. And clearly I've done something wrong. So if we can recognize the communication and especially the attempts at communication before that, and ideally in a perfect world, give people the option to communicate effectively and be listened to and understood without aggression, then they are the types of strategies that are likely to lead to aggression being used less and less in the future.
We've had a question about stimming. Now, the stimming is a way of regulating yourself. It's providing comfort, or providing a release for anxiety, or providing a way of regulating yourself. Now, sometimes it's not always appropriate to use your preferred form of stimming. I know, for example, we use hitting a boxing bag with boxing gloves at home when we're really frustrated. It works beautifully. It's not always practical. We can't always carry a boxing bag around with us. So it's looking at substituting that energy release with something that's more portable. So it could just be one of those hand strength grips works particularly well, a particularly hard stress ball that you can really dig into. It is perfectly valid to still support stimming, but it is also perfectly valid to try and meet that stimming need in the most practical way available so that it is less intrusive in day-to-day life. Especially for teens and children, they don't always want attention when they're stimming. They're already trying to regulate themselves without added attention. So it is possible to look at different things and trial and error, see what works effectively, see what's mobile, see what can work in different circumstances and different environments. We need to look at stimming as not a weird form of acting out and as an empowering way to regulate ourselves.
So we should wrap up very soon. Let me respond briefly to add one thing to the stimming, and then I'll get Shannon to mention about the certificate, and then we should wrap up. So Shannon mentioned two things about stimming there, which is around either allowing stimming as much as possible because it serves a purpose, or finding an alternative stim or an alternative way to meet that same need. A third way is to look at the reason for the stimming behavior in the first place. Very often, stimming is a way to release stress. So what is causing my stress? Maybe we can remove that instead, and then I wouldn't have all of this built up stuff that I need a punching bag to get out of my system. So there's most often a multi-pronged approach where we look at all three of those factors. How can we reduce the stress that I'm exposed to? How can we allow as much stimming as is socially appropriate? And how can we find new and better ways to stim? If we put all those together, we can usually find something that can help the situation. Okay, so we should wrap up there. We've got a QR code on the screen here with our feedback form. So we would really, really love if we could hear what you thought of today's webinar. There'll also be a form emailed out, I believe, as well as the slides from this webinar, and also an opportunity to get a certificate. So if you would like a certificate of attendance, you can email events@mable.com.au, and they'll be able to direct you the steps with that. So thank you so much for everyone who has participated in this webinar today with all of your questions and comments, and this stream of thanks that we're getting now, which is fantastic to see. It's always great to see so many people coming out to ask these type of questions and hear firsthand our autistic experience. So thanks so much for that, and we'll see you another time.
And for all of those who are asking about autism in general and diagnosis, please have a look at the references that will accompany the slides that come out to you. We've got some really great resources there, and it's a wonderful starting point to be able to understand the diagnostic process and the inclusion process and education and stimming and all of the other really awesome neurodivergent things that we cover. It's been a pleasure to be with you today, and we wish you all the very best.
And of course,
Shannon. Oh.
Sorry. And of course, if you're looking to contact us, either myself or Shannon, the best way is to have a look at our website, autismfromtheinside.com.au. So that's the easiest way if you're trying to get in touch.
You will actually find some additional content from Autism on the Inside on the Mable Learning Hub as well. So thank you to everybody that has attended. It was great to see all the participation and all of the great questions. So we will be hosting more webinars. So keep an eye on your inbox in the next couple of months. There will be more webinars. We're hearing loud and clear that people are enjoying it and they want more of them. And it's definitely something that we agree with as well. So thank you to everyone. Have a lovely evening. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.